Hi, welcome to the Silent Avenger channel. If you're enjoying the content, please consider giving it a like and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Let's dive into today's story. I'm James, 36, and I guess this is where my marriage to Michelle, 34, began to unravel. It wasn't one dramatic blowout at first, but looking back, I think the cracks were there all along. The moment that finally broke me was during an ordinary dinner that turned into anything but. Michelle and I had been married for 8 years. Life wasn't perfect, but I thought we were okay, two people trying to navigate work stress, bills, and the occasional squabble over the thermostat. That night, we were hosting a small dinner with friends. It started normal enough, laughter, wine, and good food. But everything shifted after one stupid comment. We were reminiscing about high school relationships, always a tricky topic, and Michelle, out of nowhere, dropped this line, "Oh, come on, James. You know you'll never measure up to Kyle in that department." She laughed like it was some harmless joke, but the table fell silent. Everyone exchanged awkward glances, and I could feel my face flush with heat. Kyle. Her ex. The guy she dated before me. The one she described as her first love, and occasionally mentioned with this wistful smile that always made me feel like I was competing with a ghost. I managed to plaster on a smile and change the subject, but inside, I was crumbling. After the guests left, I confronted her in the kitchen. "Why would you say something like that?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as I could. Michelle barely looked up from rinsing a glass. "It was just a joke, James. Don't be so sensitive." But it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like years of quiet comparisons spilling out into the open. I didn't want to fight, but I couldn't just let it go. "You've been making me feel like I'm in Kyle's shadow for years. And now you're just confirming it in front of everyone." Her response caught me off guard. Instead of apologizing, she doubled down. "Maybe if you didn't always act so insecure, I wouldn't have to make those comparisons." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. That one argument unleashed years of unspoken frustrations for both of us. We argued for hours, about Kyle, about how she felt I wasn't ambitious enough, and about how I always seemed to be walking on eggshells around her. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under our marriage. At some point, I realized I was done arguing. I told her I needed space and walked out the door, leaving her stunned in the kitchen. I didn't know where I was going when I left the house that night. I just needed to breathe. To think. I ended up driving aimlessly around town, my hands gripping the wheel so tight they started to ache. It wasn't just about that stupid comment anymore. It was everything. Years of feeling like I wasn't enough for Michelle, like I was living in the shadow of her perfect memories of Kyle. Michelle had always been upfront about her past. She and Kyle had dated for 3 years before he moved out of state. She once told me they broke up because their goals didn't align. He wanted adventure, and she wanted stability. But the way she talked about him? You'd think he was some tragic love story instead of just an ex-boyfriend. I used to tell myself it was normal, that everyone has a past, and as long as she was with me, it didn't matter. But now, I wasn't so sure. I parked in an empty lot and just sat there, staring at the steering wheel. My mind kept replaying her words. "You'll never measure up to Kyle." Was that really how she saw me? Had I spent the last 8 years building a life with someone who secretly wished she'd ended up with someone else? My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was Michelle. "Are you coming home?" her text read. I stared at the screen for a long time before responding. "Not tonight. I need space." Her reply came almost immediately. "You're being dramatic." That one stung. I wasn't trying to make a scene. I just needed time to figure out what I was feeling. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. For years, I'd tried so hard to be the husband she deserved, steady, reliable, supportive. And for what? To be reduced to some cheap punchline at a dinner table? I drove to a cheap motel on the edge of town. The kind of place where the carpet smells like mildew, and the walls are too thin. It wasn't home, but at least it was quiet. I laid on the stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling, trying to sort through the mess in my head. Why did she keep bringing up Kyle? Was it because I wasn't good enough, or was it something she couldn't let go of? And if it was the latter, was I just some consolation prize? That night, I didn't sleep much. My mind was too busy replaying every fight, every offhand comment, every time Michelle had mentioned Kyle's name. A part of me wondered if I'd overreacted. But the larger part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than one argument. By the time the sun came up, I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't just brush this off. Something had to change. The next morning, I woke up with a dull headache and a knot in my stomach. The fight, the comment, the years of feeling like I didn't measure up, it all came rushing back. I stared at my phone for a long time, debating whether to call Michelle. But what would I even say? Sorry for leaving? Or would it be something more like, do you even love me? Or am I just the guy you settled for? Neither option felt right, so I shoved the phone back into my pocket and headed to a nearby diner. The place smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease, but it was better than sitting in that motel room. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed a couple at the table across from me. They were laughing, leaning into each other like they didn't have a care in the world. I couldn't remember the last time Michelle and I had looked at each other like that. I tried to shake off the thought, but it clung to me like a bad cold. When had things changed between us? Was it gradual, or had I been blind to it all along? By the time I got back to my car, my phone buzzed again. It was a text from Michelle. If you're done sulking, maybe we can talk like adults. Her words hit me like a slap. I knew she had a sharp tongue, she always had, but this felt especially cruel. Still, I couldn't ignore her forever. I texted back, I'll be home later. We need to talk. When I walked through the door that evening, the house felt heavier somehow, like the tension was soaking into the walls. Michelle was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She didn't even look up when I walked in. Nice of you to come back, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. I dropped my keys on the counter and crossed my arms. We need to talk, Michelle. For real this time. She set her phone down and finally looked at me. Fine. Let's talk. What do you want to say, James? That I'm a terrible wife because I made a joke you didn't like. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. It wasn't just the joke. It's what it represents. You keep bringing up Kyle like he's some standard I'll never meet. Do you have any idea how that makes me feel? Her expression softened for a moment, but then she shook her head. James, you're reading too much into this. Kyle is part of my past. That's all. But you don't talk about him like he's in the past, I shot back. You talk about him like he's still here, like he's some ideal version of what you want. And it's exhausting. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. I didn't mean to hurt you, okay? But you can't expect me to erase my memories just because you're insecure. Insecure. I repeated, the word hitting like a sucker punch. Do you even hear yourself? You've been comparing me to him for years, and I've just been taking it. Trying to be good enough for you. And now you're calling me insecure for finally saying something. Michelle stood up, folding her arms. What do you want from me, James? Do you want me to lie and pretend he never mattered? Because I'm not going to do that. I don't want lies, Michelle, I said, my voice quieter now. I just want to feel like I'm enough for you. Like I'm not living in someone else's shadow. Her face twisted in frustration, and she turned away, pacing the room. I don't know what you want me to say. You're the one who left last night. You're the one making this into a bigger deal than it is. I felt the fight drain out of me. This wasn't going anywhere. Maybe I left because I needed to figure out if this is still worth fighting for. Her head snapped back toward me, her eyes wide. What's that supposed to mean? It means I need space, I said. I need to figure out if I can keep doing this, if we can keep doing this. For a moment, she looked like she might cry. But then just as quickly, her walls went back up. Fine, she said coldly. Go figure it out, James. But don't expect me to sit around waiting for you. I nodded, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. I'll be back to talk when I have some clarity. Without another word, I grabbed a bag, threw in some clothes, and left the house. Again. After leaving the house, I drove aimlessly again, my mind running in circles. I kept replaying Michelle's words, trying to decide if I was overreacting or if I'd finally reached my limit. Her tone, her defensiveness, it all felt like confirmation that my feelings didn't matter as much to her as her pride did. I ended up crashing at my friend Dave's place. Dave and I go way back to college, and he's the kind of guy who'll hand you a beer and let you vent without asking too many questions. When I walked in with my bag, he raised an eyebrow. Rough night. You could say that, I muttered, collapsing onto his couch. Michelle, he guessed, grabbing 2 beers from the fridge. Yeah. He handed me a bottle and sat across from me. Want to talk about it, or just sit in silence? I took a long sip, then sighed. She compared me to her ex. Kyle. Again. Dave frowned. Ouch. It's not just the comment, I said, leaning forward. It's everything. It's like no matter what I do, I'll never be good enough for her. I thought we were happy, but now, I don't even know. Dave nodded, letting me spill my guts. I told him about the fight, about how I felt like Michelle never truly moved on from Kyle. By the end, I was more drained than angry. What are you gonna do? Dave asked after a moment. I don't know, I admitted. I told her I need space. I'm hoping some time apart will help me figure things out. Dave nodded slowly. Just be careful, man. Space is good, but it can also be dangerous. If you want to fix things, you've got to make sure you're both on the same page about what this time apart means. His words stuck with me. As much as I wanted to sort out my own feelings, I also didn't want Michelle to think I was just walking away for good. The next few days were strange. I stayed at Dave's, went to work, and tried to keep my mind occupied, but my thoughts always drifted back to Michelle. Part of me missed her, missed the life we'd built together. But another part of me wondered if we'd just been ignoring the cracks for too long. Michelle texted me a couple of times during those days. Short, clipped messages like, "Did you take your charger?" Or "Are you coming to pick up the rest of your stuff?" I didn't respond right away. I wasn't ready. Then, on the third day, she sent a longer text. "James, I know things have been tense between us, but I'm not sure how we got here. I'm not perfect, and I know I've said things that hurt you. But I need to know if you're willing to work on this, or if you've already made up your mind." I stared at the screen for what felt like forever. Her words sounded sincere, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't fully understanding why I was so hurt. Finally, I replied, "I'm not giving up, Michelle. But I need to figure out how to move forward without feeling like I'm competing with someone who's not even in the picture anymore. I need time, and I need to know if you're willing to meet me halfway." She didn't respond right away, and I tried not to let the silence bother me. The next morning, Michelle called. Her voice was quieter than usual, like she was unsure of herself. "Can we meet? Just to talk?" I hesitated. Part of me wasn't ready, but another part of me knew we couldn't keep dancing around this forever. "Yeah," I said. "Let's meet." We agreed on a coffee shop halfway between Dave's place and our house. I got there early and spent the time fidgeting with my cup, mentally preparing myself for whatever she was going to say. When she walked in, she looked tired. Her makeup was lighter than usual, and there were faint dark circles under her eyes. She sat across from me, folding her hands on the table. "Thanks for meeting me," she said softly. I nodded, waiting for her to continue. "I've been doing a lot of thinking these past few days," she began. "And I realized, maybe I've been unfair to you. I didn't mean to hurt you, James. But I think I've been holding on to things I didn't even realize I was still carrying." Her words surprised me, but I didn't interrupt. I wanted to hear her out. "I don't think about Kyle the way you think I do," she said. "He's not some ideal I'm comparing you to. But maybe I've been using him as a shield. A way to deflect when I feel like I'm not happy with myself." That hit me harder than I expected. "So this isn't about me?" She shook her head. "Not entirely. But I know I've made it feel like it is, and I'm sorry for that." For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe we could untangle this mess after all. As I sat across from Michelle, her words hung heavy in the air. "I've been using Kyle as a shield." It wasn't exactly the explanation I expected, but it made a strange kind of sense. Still, I couldn't let her off the hook just yet. "Why, Michelle?" I asked, my voice steady but low. "Why would you use him as some scapegoat in our marriage? Why not just talk to me about what you're feeling?" She sighed, looking down at her hands. "I don't know, James. Maybe because it was easier. Kyle was part of my past, someone I could bring up without it feeling like I was blaming you. But I never realized how much it was hurting you. That wasn't fair, and I see that now." Her admission softened something in me, but it didn't erase the years of feeling inadequate. "You made me feel like I was never enough," I said, my voice cracking despite my efforts to stay composed. "Do you know what that's like? To feel like you're competing with someone who isn't even here." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "I'm sorry," she said, and for the first time, it felt genuine. "You're right, I made you feel that way, and it wasn't fair. I think I've been scared of being vulnerable with you. of admitting that I'm not as confident as I seem. I blinked, surprised by her honesty. Michelle had always been the strong one in our relationship, the one who seemed to have it all together. Hearing her admit to insecurities was unexpected, but it also felt like a breakthrough. "Why are you scared to be vulnerable with me?" I asked, leaning forward. She hesitated, then said, "Because if I'm vulnerable, I lose control. And if I lose control, I feel weak. And I don't want you to see me as weak, James. I don't want anyone to." I let her words sink in. For years, I'd thought Michelle's confidence was a sign that she didn't need me in the same way I needed her. But now, I was starting to see that her confidence was more of a mask than I realized. "Michelle," I said gently, "being vulnerable doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. And if we can't be honest with each other, how are we supposed to fix this?" She nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. "I know. And I want to try, James. I really do. But I need to know, are you willing to try too? Even after everything I've said, everything I've done." I sat back, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know," I admitted. "I want to try, but I need to feel like you're in this for the right reasons. Not because you're scared of what people will think if we don't make it." Her face fell, but she nodded. "I understand. And I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I want this. That I want us." It was a start, but I knew it wouldn't be enough on its own. We both had a lot of work to do, individually and together, if we were going to move forward. "Then let's take it slow," I said finally. "No more pretending everything's fine when it's not. We need to be honest, even if it hurts." She gave me a small, tentative smile. "Okay. Slow. I can do that." We left the coffee shop with a fragile sense of hope, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the road ahead was going to be harder than either of us realized. The ride home was quiet, but not tense like it had been before. Michelle stared out the window, her hands folded in her lap, while I focused on the road. I could feel the weight of everything we'd said in the coffee shop lingering between us. When we pulled into the driveway, she hesitated before getting out. "Are you coming inside?" she asked, her voice soft. I shook my head. "Not yet. I think I'm going to stay at Dave's a little longer. Just until I figure out where my head's at." She nodded, but her eyes gave her away. She wasn't happy about it. Still, she didn't push. "Okay. Just, let me know if you need anything." "I will," I said, watching as she disappeared into the house. Back at Dave's, I spent most of the night replaying the conversation with Michelle. Part of me wanted to believe she was being genuine, that she was ready to let go of the walls she'd built. But another part of me couldn't help wondering if we were just delaying the inevitable. "Man, you're brooding again," Dave said, tossing a bag of chips onto the coffee table. "You've been staring at the same spot on the wall for 20 minutes. I glanced over at him, half smiling. "Just thinking." "Thinking's fine," he said, cracking open a beer. "But don't let it paralyze you. If you want to fix things with Michelle, you've got to actually do something about it." "I know," I said. "I'm just trying to figure out what that something is." Dave shrugged. "Start small. Communication. Honesty. Maybe get some outside help, like a counselor or something. You can't expect to untangle years of issues on your own." His words made sense, but the idea of opening up to a stranger about our problems felt daunting. Still, it wasn't like we were doing a stellar job handling things ourselves. "I'll think about it," I said, and Dave nodded like that was good enough for now. The next day, I texted Michelle. "I think we should try counseling. If we're going to make this work, we need help." Her response came quicker than I expected. "Okay. I'll look into it. Thank you for being open to this." It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. In the days that followed, Michelle sent me a few recommendations for therapists. I picked one who specialized in couples dealing with trust and communication issues, because let's be real, that was our entire relationship in a nutshell. Our first session was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, I tried to focus on myself. I started going for long walks after work, trying to clear my head and figure out what I wanted, not just from Michelle, but from life in general. One evening, as I was walking through the park, I got a text from Michelle. "Thinking about you. Hope you're okay." For the first time in days, I smiled. "I'm okay. Hope you are too." Her reply came a minute later. "I am. Thanks for asking." It was a small exchange, but it felt good, like maybe we were finding our way back to each other, one step at a time. The day of our first counseling session came faster than I expected. I pulled into the parking lot early, my stomach twisting with a mix of nerves and doubt. Michelle's car wasn't there yet, so I sat in my truck, trying to convince myself I wasn't wasting my time. A few minutes later, she arrived. She stepped out of her car and gave me a small wave. She looked nervous too, her hands fidgeting as she adjusted her bag on her shoulder. I got out and walked toward her, the awkwardness between us almost unbearable. "Hey," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hey," I replied. We stood there for a moment before she finally said, "Ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be," I said, and we walked into the building together. The counselor, Dr. Reeves, was a middle-aged woman with a kind face and a calm demeanor. She welcomed us warmly and gestured for us to sit on the couch across from her. "So what brings you here today?" she asked once we were settled. Michelle and I glanced at each other, waiting for the other to start. Finally, I spoke up. "We've been struggling. For a while now. I guess we just stopped communicating the way we should." "And when you do communicate, what's that like?" Dr. Reeves asked. Michelle sighed. "Lately? It's mostly arguments. Or silence." Dr. Reeves nodded, jotting something down on her notepad. "And what do you think is at the root of these arguments?" I hesitated, but I knew I had to be honest. For me, it's feeling like I'm not enough. Like no matter what I do, I'm always being compared to someone else. Michelle looked down at her hands, her face flushing slightly. "I know I've made him feel that way," she admitted. "And I hate that I've done that. But I didn't realize how much it was affecting him until it all came out." "That's a good start," Dr. Reeves said. "Acknowledging the problem is the first step. But what I'd like to know is, why do you think this pattern developed? What's driving these feelings on both sides?" We spent the next hour digging into things we'd never really talked about before. My feelings of inadequacy, Michelle's fear of vulnerability, and how both of us had been holding onto unspoken expectations and resentments. By the end of the session, I felt emotionally drained but also lighter. Like we'd finally opened a door that had been locked for years. Dr. Reeves gave us some homework. Write down 3 things we appreciated about each other and 3 things we wanted to work on, both individually and as a couple. It felt like a small task, but as I drove back to Dave's that evening, I realized how much I struggled to put those feelings into words. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, staring at the blank page. The first thing I wrote under appreciations was easy, her determination. No matter what, Michelle always found a way to push through challenges. The next 2 took more thought, but I eventually added her sense of humor and the way she supports me when I need it most. When I got to the things to work on section, my pen hovered over the paper for a while. Finally, I wrote communication, trust, and being honest about what we're feeling. It felt like a start. The next time I saw Michelle, she handed me her list. "I worked on it all night," she said with a small smile. "So did I admitted. We swapped notebooks, and as I read her list, I felt a lump rise in my throat. She'd written things I hadn't expected, like his patience and the way he always makes me feel safe, even when I don't deserve it. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we were truly seeing each other again. The lists felt like a bridge, small, fragile, but enough to remind us why we'd fallen in love in the first place. That night, Michelle and I sat at the kitchen table, notebooks between us, and talked about what we'd written. "When you said I make you feel safe," I began, my voice hesitant, "I guess I didn't realize how much that mattered to you. I've been so caught up in my own doubts, I didn't think you noticed the effort I put into being steady." Michelle gave me a soft smile. "It does matter, James. I know I don't always show it, but it does. You're my anchor when everything feels out of control." Hearing her say that did something to me. For so long, I'd felt like I wasn't enough for her, like Kyle's memory was the standard I'd never meet. But now it felt like she was finally letting me see her, not the confident, put-together version she showed the world, but the vulnerable person underneath. "What about you?" I asked. "How do you feel about the things I wrote for us to work on?" Michelle hesitated, tracing her finger along the edge of the notebook. "I think you're right about communication. I haven't been honest with you, or with myself, about a lot of things. And I've realized that maybe part of why I bring up Kyle is because I don't want to face the ways I've fallen short." Her words hit me hard. "Fallen short? How?" She looked at me with tear-filled eyes. "I've been scared, James. Scared that I'll let you down, that I'll fail as a wife, or that you'll wake up one day and realize you could have done better. I reached across the table and took her hand. Michelle, I've never wanted better. I've only ever wanted you. Her shoulders shook as the tears fell, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I held her while she cried. It wasn't about winning the argument or proving a point. It was about being there, about finally seeing each other for who we really were. The weeks that followed were a mix of progress and setbacks. Counseling sessions became a regular part of our routine, and while they weren't always easy, they forced us to confront things we'd buried for years. Michelle opened up about how her parents' divorce had shaped her fear of vulnerability. They fought all the time, she explained during one session. And then one day, my dad just left. No warning, no explanation. I think that's why I've always tried to keep my guard up, to make sure no one could leave me like that again. Hearing her say that made me see our arguments in a new light. It wasn't just about Kyle or my insecurities. It was about two people trying to protect themselves from getting hurt, even if it meant hurting each other in the process. On my end, I had to confront my tendency to hold on to resentment. I've spent so much time focusing on what I felt I wasn't getting from Michelle, I admitted to Dr. Reeves, that I never stopped to think about what I wasn't giving her in return. It was a hard truth to face, but it also felt like a step forward. One evening, Michelle surprised me by suggesting we take a walk through the park where we'd had our first date. As we strolled past the benches and the little pond, she slipped her hand into mine. "Do you remember the first time we came here?" she asked, smiling softly. "Yeah," I said. "You made fun of me for tripping over that tree root." She laughed, the sound warm and familiar. "And you still married me after that. Guess you're more forgiving than I thought." Her teasing felt like a sign that maybe, just maybe, we were finding our way back to each other. But even as we made progress, there were still moments of doubt. I couldn't ignore the voice in the back of my head whispering, "What if this isn't enough? What if the cracks are too deep to fix?" Michelle must have sensed my hesitation because one night, as we lay in bed, she turned to me and said, "James, do you still love me?" The question caught me off guard, but I didn't hesitate in my answer. "Yes, I do. But I think we're learning that love isn't always enough. We have to keep choosing each other, every day." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I want to keep choosing you. I just hope it's not too late." Her words echoed in my mind long after she fell asleep. I wanted to believe it wasn't too late, but I also knew that only time would tell if we were strong enough to rebuild what we'd lost. The weeks of counseling and small gestures helped, but the road was still uneven. For every breakthrough Michelle and I had, there seemed to be moments that dragged us back into old patterns. One of those moments came during a quiet Sunday afternoon. I was sorting through some old boxes in the garage, trying to declutter, when I stumbled on a photo album. It was from before we got married, pictures from vacations, birthdays, and parties we'd gone to as a couple. Flipping through it, I found a photo of Michelle at some college event. She was sitting on the hood of a car, smiling at the camera, and beside her was Kyle. The sight of him, his arm casually draped over her shoulders, felt like a gut punch. I wasn't angry, but the image stirred something in me that I couldn't ignore. Later that evening, I showed the photo to Michelle. "Do you remember this?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. She looked at it for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, that was spring break senior year." "Why?" "No reason," I said, though my tone gave me away. Michelle set the photo aside and met my gaze. "James, it's just a picture. I don't even remember taking it." "I know," I said. "But seeing it, it made me realize how much I've been carrying this weight. This constant comparison I feel between me and him." Her face softened, and she reached for my hand. "James, Kyle doesn't matter. Not anymore. I know I've given you reasons to think otherwise, but I'm trying to let go of the past. I want you to let go of it too." I nodded, but her words felt easier said than done. The next day, during our counseling session, I brought up the photo. Dr. Reeves nodded thoughtfully as I described how it had stirred up old insecurities. "It's not unusual for unresolved feelings to resurface when you're faced with reminders of the past," she said. "But the key is to ask yourself, what does this photo really represent to you? Is it about Kyle, or is it about something deeper?" I thought about her question for a long moment. "I think it's about feeling like I'll never fully be Michelle's first choice. Like no matter what I do, I'll always be second best." Michelle's face crumpled, and she shook her head. "James, that's not true. I don't know how to make you believe me, but it's not. I married you because I love you. I chose you. Her words were sincere, but the years of feeling otherwise made them hard to fully accept. Dr. Reeves stepped in, her tone gentle but firm. James, it sounds like you're holding onto a narrative that you've built over time. It's understandable, but it's also not the whole truth. If you and Michelle are going to move forward, you both need to actively rewrite that story together. After the session, Michelle and I sat in the car, neither of us speaking for a while. Finally, she broke the silence. I know I've made mistakes, she said, her voice trembling. But I need you to believe me when I say that I want this to work. I don't want to lose you, James. I looked at her, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes. I don't want to lose you either. But we have to be honest about what it's going to take to rebuild this. It's not going to happen overnight. I know, she said, wiping away a tear. But I'm willing to put in the work if you are. I reached over and took her hand. Then let's keep trying. One day at a time. That night, for the first time in months, Michelle and I had a real conversation. Not about our problems, but about our hopes for the future. It felt like a small step, but it was one we desperately needed. As I lay in bed later, I thought about what Dr. Reeves had said about rewriting our story. Maybe it wasn't about erasing the past, but about building something new, something stronger than what we had before. The days that followed felt lighter, though the weight of our struggles wasn't entirely gone. Michelle and I worked on reconnecting, starting with small things, sharing dinners without distractions, taking evening walks, and even laughing at old inside jokes that still held some magic. One evening, as we sat on the couch flipping through TV channels, Michelle rested her head on my shoulder. "Do you think we can really get through this?" she asked quietly. I didn't answer right away. I think it depends on both of us. We can't just fix things for a week and pretend everything's fine. It has to be consistent. We need to be honest with each other about what's working and what isn't. She nodded. "I'm scared, James. But I'm trying." "I know," I said, wrapping an arm around her. "And I am too." Our next counseling session focused on building trust. Dr. Reeves suggested we each share one thing we've been holding back from the other. It didn't have to be earth-shattering, just honest. Michelle went first. "I'm scared that I've done too much damage. That even if we stay together, you'll never look at me the same way again." Her vulnerability caught me off guard. "I can't pretend the hurt isn't there," I admitted. "But I'm trying to focus on the things you're doing now, the effort you're putting in. That matters more than the past." When it was my turn, I said, "I worry that I've been too caught up in my own insecurities to see the ways I've hurt you. I don't want to keep repeating that." Michelle reached for my hand, and I squeezed hers. That night, we sat at the kitchen table again, making plans for a weekend away, a chance to focus on each other, away from everything else. It wasn't a solution, but it felt like a step in the right direction. For the first time in a long time, I felt a small cautious hope that we might just make it through this. Michelle and I decided on a small cabin a few hours from town. It was nothing fancy, just a quiet place with a view of the woods and no Wi-Fi. As we drove there, the silence between us wasn't uncomfortable for once. It felt like we were both easing into the idea of reconnecting. The first evening, we kept things simple. We cooked dinner together, pasta and garlic bread, and talked about anything but the heavy stuff. For the first time in months, I caught myself laughing at Michelle's terrible jokes. Later, as we sat on the porch with mugs of tea, she broke the quiet. "Do you remember when we used to dream about getting away like this? No distractions, no stress, just us." "I do," I said, staring out at the trees. "But it feels like we forgot how to do it." She nodded. "Maybe this is a fresh start." I reached for her hand. "Maybe it is." The next day, we hiked a trail near the cabin. The woods were peaceful, and for a while, it felt like we were just two people in love again, unburdened by everything else. Halfway through, Michelle stopped and turned to me. "I'm really sorry, James. For all the ways I've hurt you. I can't change the past, but I want to be better, for us." Her words caught me off guard, but they felt genuine. "I believe you," I said. "And I'm trying to let go of the things I've held on to. I don't want to keep looking backward." We stood there for a moment, the quiet of the woods wrapping around us like a blanket. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it felt like progress. That night, we sat by the fireplace, sharing stories from the early days of our relationship, funny, awkward memories that reminded us why we'd fallen for each other in the first place. As Michelle rested her head on my shoulder, I realized that this weekend wasn't about erasing our problems. It was about reminding ourselves of what we were fighting for. When we returned home from the cabin, it felt like we'd taken a small step forward. Things weren't perfect, but there was a sense of ease that hadn't been there in months. Michelle and I settled into a new routine, making more time for each other, being more open, and working through the moments when old habits crept back in. One evening, after dinner, Michelle sat across from me at the table. "I've been thinking about what Dr. Reeves said," she began, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her glass. "About rewriting our story. What about it?" I asked. "I think part of me has been scared to fully let go of the past, of Kyle, because I didn't want to admit that I've been holding on to something that doesn't matter anymore," she said. "It's not about him, James. It's about me. About feeling like I have to prove I'm still worth something." Her honesty caught me off guard, but it also made me respect her even more. "You don't have to prove anything, Michelle. Not to me, not to anyone." She smiled softly. "I know that now. But it's going to take time for me to fully believe it." That night, as we lay in bed, I found myself reaching for her hand under the covers. "I've been holding on to things too," I admitted. "Resentments, doubts. It's like I've been waiting for you to mess up again, just so I could say, I knew it." Michelle turned to me, her expression unreadable. "Do you still feel that way?" "Not as much anymore," I said. "But I think it's going to take time for me to fully let it go too." She nodded. "We'll get there. Together." The next few weeks weren't without their struggles. There were still moments when we fell back into old patterns, miscommunication, frustration, or doubts creeping in. But there were also moments of connection that reminded us why we were trying so hard to make this work. Michelle surprised me one evening with a small gesture, a handwritten letter she'd left on my pillow. In it, she thanked me for not giving up on her and promised to keep fighting for us. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but it felt sincere. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were finally moving in the right direction. Over the next few weeks, Michelle and I started focusing on the little things that kept us connected, texting each other during the day, going for walks after dinner, and sitting together in the evenings without distractions. They weren't big gestures, but they made the house feel less like a battleground and more like a home again. One evening, Michelle came home from work and handed me a small envelope. "I thought this might be good for us," she said nervously. Inside was a gift card for a cooking class at a local studio. "I remember how much fun we had trying to make that ridiculous soufflé on our anniversary a few years ago," she said, smiling. I laughed, the memory coming back to me. "You mean the one that collapsed so badly we ended up ordering pizza?" She grinned. "Exactly. I figured maybe it's time for a rematch, with some actual guidance this time." The cooking class turned out to be more than just a fun activity. Working side by side, chopping vegetables and laughing at each other's mistakes, reminded us of how much we'd always enjoyed being a team. At one point, the instructor complimented our great communication, and Michelle shot me a playful look. "Bet she wouldn't have said that a few months ago," she whispered. "Maybe we're getting better at this," I replied, squeezing her hand. Later that night, as we drove home, Michelle turned to me. "I think that was the first time in a while I felt like us again." "Me too," I said. It wasn't a magic fix, but it felt like a small victory, a reminder that we could still find joy together, even after everything we'd been through. Back at home, we sat on the couch, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about our plans for the future. For the first time in months, the idea of our future didn't feel like a question mark. It felt real, possible. As things started to settle, Michelle and I found ourselves tackling the bigger, harder conversations we'd avoided for so long. One evening after dinner, she surprised me by bringing it up. "James," she began, hesitating slightly, "do you think we'll ever fully move past this? I mean, really move past it?" Her question caught me off guard, but it was something I'd been thinking about too. "I think we're making progress," I said. "But there's a difference between healing and forgetting. I don't think we'll ever forget what happened, Michelle. And maybe that's okay." She tilted her head, curious. "Okay? How?" "Because it's part of our story now," I said. "It's messy and painful, but it's also brought us here, to a place where we're finally being honest with each other. If we can learn from it instead of running from it, I think that's what matters." Michelle nodded, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. "I don't deserve how patient you've been with me." "It's not about deserving," I said softly. "It's about deciding what we're willing to fight for." The next week in counseling, Dr. Reeves asked us a question that hit like a lightning bolt. What does success look like for your marriage now? If you could rebuild it into anything, what would it be? Michelle was the first to answer. I want a partnership where we feel safe to be ourselves, where we don't hold things back out of fear of being judged or rejected. I want us to be a team, not just two people living side by side. Her words resonated with me. I want the same, I said. And I want us to keep choosing each other, even when it's hard. I don't expect perfection, but I do want honesty and effort. That's how we rebuild trust. Dr. Reeves nodded approvingly. Those are strong foundations. The key will be to remember this vision when things get tough, because they will. But it's clear you both care deeply about each other and are willing to do the work. After that session, Michelle and I went for coffee and spent an hour just talking about what we wanted our marriage to look like, what we needed from each other, and even what we were afraid of. It felt raw but also refreshing, like we were finally laying everything on the table. I think we're stronger than we give ourselves credit for, she said as we left the cafe. I smiled, feeling a flicker of hope. Maybe we're finally learning how to be. A few weeks later, Michelle and I were sitting on the back porch, watching the sunset. It had become our new ritual, spending a quiet moment together each evening, just talking or enjoying the stillness. That night, though, the air felt heavier, like something was left unsaid. "James," she began, her voice steady but low, "do you think we're really meant to stay together?" Her question hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. We'd worked so hard these past few months, counseling, honest conversations, rebuilding trust. But deep down, I'd been wondering the same thing. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "I think we've come a long way, but I also think we're still carrying scars. And I don't know if they'll ever fully heal." Michelle nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I've been thinking about that too. And as much as I love you, James, I wonder if we've done all we can for each other. If staying together is helping us or holding us back." Her words hurt, but they also rang true. Our love was still there, but it felt different now, more fragile, more complex. "I think we've grown a lot through this," I said, choosing my words carefully. "But maybe part of that growth is realizing that we're not the same people we were when we started. And maybe that's okay." Michelle turned to me, tears glistening in her eyes. "I don't want to hate each other down the line because we stayed out of fear of letting go." I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I don't want that either." We sat there in silence for a long time, the weight of the moment settling around us. Finally, Michelle spoke again. "I think we should part ways," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Not because we failed, but because we've done everything we can. And I'm grateful for all of it, for you." My throat tightened, but I nodded. "Me too. I'll always be grateful for you." The decision wasn't easy, but it felt right. Over the next few weeks, we worked together to figure out the logistics, splitting our assets, deciding who would keep the house, and supporting each other through the transition. On the day Michelle moved out, we hugged for a long time. "This isn't the end," she whispered. "It's just a new chapter for both of us." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. It wasn't easy, but I felt a strange sense of peace knowing that we'd both done our best. Michelle and I stayed in touch, not as lovers but as two people who had shared something meaningful and learned from it. We'd loved, we'd struggled, and in the end, we'd let each other go with grace. And for that, I would always be thankful.